Okay, welcome Daniel T. O'Brien to talk with me about Evolving Complex Systems in Boston is the title that I have in mind for this podcast. And first of all, welcome. So great to see you.
Yeah, likewise, David. Thanks so much for having me on.
So you are my former PhD student who helped me start the Binghamton Neighborhood Project. And then you went on to Boston and accomplished much, much greater things by co-founding the Boston Area Research Initiative, I think with Robert Sampson at Harvard University, if that's correct. And so that's an amazing example of a consortium of universities that advises the city of Boston. And we're here in part to promote and discuss your new book, The Pointillistic City, which
Mhm.
I've read and really enjoyed. In addition to that, as many people know, my daughter Katie has just become the new mayor of Seattle, and this gives me an added interest in,
Congratulations on that, by the way.
yeah, congratulations or condolences. I'm not
Right?
sure what
Uh, it's
what's it.
both.
It's bold. Yeah, it's bold. Um, and so, of course, I'm eager to just think about all cities and then Boston as some kind of a model since Michelle Wu was so popular. And there's some sense in which a progressive agenda is being successfully pursued in Boston, and that BARI might have something to do with it. All of this is what we'll be talking about. Now, let's begin with your book and the beautiful metaphor that you created with the pointillistic city. Explain the metaphor and why you drew upon the artistic tradition of pointillism to make your point about Boston.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I mean, for those who haven't read the book, which I assume is many of the people listening to this, the the thrust of the book and the basic practical idea was that we as human beings in society live at multiple geographic scales every day, right? We have a home, we have a street, we have a neighborhood, we have a town, city, and we experience all those things. And all those things have what academics or scientists would call processes, right? Mechanisms, things that are happening at that level that affect us, right? So we talk about it sometimes as a neighborhood effect, right? What is it like to live in this neighborhood? How does that impact me beyond just who I am? But we also have, you know, our building. Our building matters, right? Whether I'm warm or cold right now is dependent on my own insulation. Probably not a lot to do with my neighborhood, right? And so on and so forth at all these different levels. And when I was reflecting on this, it seemed to me a lot like a pointillistic painting, right? In the sense that a pointillistic painting is composed of these thousands of tiny dots that coalesce into objects that then are arranged into a full image. And as a viewer, you're having to engage with all of those things at the same time in order to digest the work of art. And very similarly, right, our cities and even our towns are composed of little tiny dots on a map at least, which are addresses and properties, and then those are organized into streets and as neighborhoods and then up into municipalities, and those different scales and levels are part and parcel of our daily life, and you kind of need to think about all of them at some level in order to fully comprehend any given phenomenon, whether it be public health or it be crime, or in another case in the book, environmental justice, or gentrification, or academic achievement, or anything else.
Yeah, and one of the things you point out is that in the voluminous literature on cities, the neighborhood is the classic unit, um, and um, and which might be appropriate in some cases, but not in others. And I think one of the main points of your book is that actually, in many cases, the neighborhood is too large, and what we need to, where things are really going on, is at scales smaller than the neighborhood. It might be the street or even the single property. Although we don't know, and in some cases the neighborhood is the right unit or the super neighborhood. So please elaborate on that theme, and especially on the micro part, how it is that very often actually the neighborhood is too large a unit for what we need to understand.
Yeah, no, that's precisely right, David. And the neighborhood has really been the dominant fixture in urban science for the last, well, 150 years or so that people have been doing what we would call urban science. And I mean, there's very good reason for that. I mean, intellectually, it's the Chicago School of Sociology in the 1920s or so really sort of reified the neighborhood as the building block of the city. And makes a lot of sense because at the time they were looking at cities like Chicago that were just a, kind of a pastiche or a collage of ethnic enclaves, right? So each one had its own very specific and distinct character, and then that was then that village within the city, as it were, and they were trying to kind of extend a sociological understanding of rural contexts into an urban context. So that's where we've been for a very long time, and that's really kind of permeated sociology, public health, even some developmental psychology, criminology, right? A lot of these disciplines that have been engaged with cities. To give credit to planners and architects, there has been a little bit more of the hyper local thinking in those spaces for obvious reasons, right? They plan buildings and spaces at a much more local level all the time. Um, but with that all said, right, there's this sort of lacuna, if you will, right? There's a sort of gap in if we're looking at the world in terms of neighborhoods, how do we think about things within neighborhoods? How do we think about diversity therein? And I've had this conversation with a lot of people since writing the book, and even when writing the book, including Rob Sampson, who you mentioned, a close colleague, and for those who don't know him, a pretty influential sociologist who comes out of the Chicago school tradition. And we've discussed a bit whether the classic Chicago school tradition and everyone following it actually said everything in the neighborhood is exactly the same.
No, they probably didn't.
No, they didn't,
Who
right?
would?
They,
Why
they,
would they?
they never
I think,
actually said that, right? And if you read some of the more ethnographic stuff, right, it very much covers like, oh, well, we're talking about a neighborhood effect, but it's really playing out at the bus stop.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. I mean, this is
Or,
the kind of thing where we all know I mean, we're human beings, and so we know this in a sense. But I think that there's a technology component to this that I want to bring out because back then, calling attention to neighborhoods was probably more generally calling attention to small scales. And given the technology available at the time, you couldn't really get hyperlocal as much as you can now. So do you think that's a fair statement? And
absolutely.
what is the role of big data here? Because and technology, because I think that there's obviously when we think of the smart cities movement and so on, at times that became too technocratic. And yet at the same time, when we do it right, that too needs technology. And so I think the role of technology and big data. Could you please speak on that topic just to make sure that we put that topic on the table? And
Oh,
actually bring in AI to the extent that you want.
oh, that might be a different and extra conversation.
Right.
But yeah, to your first to your first point, um, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that our science is only able to go as far as our tools, right? Our microscopes and our telescopes can actually see. And like, and you said back then, and you may have been referring to the 1920s. You may have been referring to the 1990s when Rob was doing his work. I can remember, when we were working together in the late 2000 aughts, right? And I remember doing these literature reviews with you. And there's one paper I remember it stuck out to me a lot. It was just a standard journal article in a public health journal. It was probably Social Science and Medicine or something. So not a groundbreaking paper, but also just a paper that stuck with me. Where the title of the paper was small, looking at effects of small scale processes or something like that on smoking behavior or behavioral health. And I remember opening it and being really excited that it was going to be really localized effects. And I realized pretty quickly that the lowest level, their definition of small scale effects or small place effects was the zip code,
Yeah, that's right. Or the block
which
group, or the block group. That would
well, yeah.
mean
Well, zip
GIS
code
units.
contains multiple census tracts, right? Like zip code is big for a human being. And so like I was stunned in that moment. And the reality is I don't think we had the methodological capacity to go much lower than that, except in really special cases. Until big data, as you say, became available. And it's not just so I'll go on one of my other evangelical tropes here, which is it's not that the data is big that's special, it's that the data are basically more precise than anything we've ever had access to. That doesn't mean they're always accurate. There are going to be biases, there are skews in there because of the way some of these data sets are generated, because they were not generated for research. They're often like if I'm analyzing 311 calls or 911 calls, or someone is analyzing cell phone mobility data to track how people move across space, right? There's a data generation process there that has non-systematic, or no, sorry, has systematic biases. So that's real. But at the same time, you are capturing behaviors and actions that you could never capture before, and you're capturing them with a spatiotemporal precision. Like this thing happened at this exact place that we've never really had access to at scale. And so the purview of ethnography, in all reality, of saying this is happening at the bus stop, which had to occur through months of interviews with one neighborhood, could now be analyzed in a matter of minutes of processing very large data sets, and mapping them and then coordinating them with other information. Now, I don't mean to take that away from ethnography. You're still getting a much richer story there, but the scale of that and being able to do it for an entire city rapidly is really novel. I'd say, with the exception of crime data, hasn't really been available until 10 to 15 years ago.
Yeah, and so on. Okay, AI is going to put that on steroids, even more so with AI if appropriately configured. I actually want to call attention to one of your studies and PhD as an example of this, and something I'm really proud of because it's been taken up by um, one of my other PhD students, Rick O'Gorman in England, and one of his PhD students. That makes him my academic grandchild, David McAlevey, working with Jim Cohen, who some of the listeners will know, and his wonderful work on social baseline theory on the effect of the built environment on physical and mental health. And the work that we did, as you know, of course, but I'm now describing it for our audience, was that we showed photographs of neighborhoods in Binghamton to college students, and then we had them um, first of all, estimate the quality of the neighborhood from the photograph, and then play a cooperation game with somebody from that neighborhood, and being good boys and girls with behavioral economics experiments. This actually was an experiment, was a game. There really was someone they were playing with, so on and so forth. And what we showed was that the just the sight of the neighborhood through a photograph had a huge effect on the cooperative behavior of the college student participants, that they would basically cooperate with someone from a nice neighborhood and not from someone from what seemed to be a not so nice um, neighborhood without ever meeting that person. And so that they were inferring information from the environment that was influencing their behavior, all of which makes great sense from an evolutionary perspective because any animal, turtle or squirrel or fox, is going to assess its environment and extract information from its environment. And I believe that remember that you did an analysis of the photographs and showed that what specifically was influencing behavior were things that indicated neglect of the residents, something that the residents could have done something about, as opposed to other things like maybe, cracked streets or something like that that they couldn't do something about. First of all, do I remember all of that correctly?
Yeah, that's a good summary.
Good, good. Okay. And so what Rick and David did was that they made use of this big panel study, this big study in the UK following hundreds of families longitudinally and gathering actual biomedical data on them, such as C-reactive proteins. And so what they could then do is show that the people that were living in neglected residences actually had a higher level of C-reactive protein. So that this was impacting their physical health that you could measure um, with biomarkers. And so and of course you couldn't do that without big data. Or precise data, I should say. So
Yeah.
anyhow, this is the kind of thing that that's happening. Well, let's actually look at this at the environmental justice end of things, at this microspatial variation extends not just to such things as crime, but also to such things as heat islands, pollution, and so on. So tell us that part of the story.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, the EJ aspect of it is really fascinating. And as you're alluding to, it's not where I started, right? The book started with kind of wading into this debate about local places and communities in the criminology literature that I had been, as you may have mentioned to your listeners or on your website, right? I am affiliated with the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Northeastern, and so I do some work in that space. But I feel like you'll appreciate this. From a philosophy of science perspective, I looked at the results. I looked at the theory I was developing, and I was like, one phenomenon isn't enough, right? We need to find something else, right? This needs to be generalizable in some way, and for reasons somewhat substantive, but actually more ethical for me, I thought environmental justice is the thing that I need to turn my attention to, right? This is the thing that I think is most pressing for our planet and our communities right now. So I turned to that and I applied a lot of the same techniques of thinking about instead of crime, building to building and street to street, heat, street to street, and flooding street to street, and air pollution street to street within communities. And there's this sort of parallel thinking in the environmental justice literature that most of the rhetoric around environmental justice is disenfranchised populations essentially are become subject to environmental hazards, right? Where are you going to build the airport? Well, you build it next to the neighborhoods where people don't have much of a say, right? Who don't have the political power to push back against having an airport built next to them. Same thing with who gets the highway going through the neighborhood, or where does the new train line get,
Yeah, it's really
built.
shocking in retrospect, but
Yeah, and so that's kind of the standard. And so the environmental justice folks, this whole perspective and this recognition came out in the 1980s. And interestingly enough, back then it was almost exclusively about pollution. It basically took about 20 years to be about anything but pollution. And as climate change kind of marched on, folks recognized in that world that, well, there's a lot of things that this could be relevant to. Uh, but again, since it was based on demographics and power structures across a city's, diverse population, you end up with a neighborhood model, right? And actually, even a more sort of um, implied set of assumptions around neighborhoods than what I was describing earlier with the like, well, no one ever really said anything about what was going on inside the neighborhood systematically. Likewise here, in a way, that literature, it acknowledged that there were different communities of low income, different communities of people of color, so on and so forth. But it never really addressed the fact that some of them might experience something different from another one, right? The one that's next to the airport is the one that's experiencing the impact of the airport. The one that's not is not, and maybe experiencing its own things from other planning decisions that were unjust. But you know, that sort of nuance was not necessarily being acknowledged. And then beyond that, no one was really talking about what was happening street to street within those communities. Some practitioners definitely were taking that into account as they're operating, but there was no systematic kind of scientific approach to that. So yeah, I saw that as an opening, as many scientists do, right? I saw that as an opening to answer some good questions and a place where the theory that I had developed could be useful. And applied it, and it turned out, as one reviewer of the book said, um, Dan may have chosen two examples that fit his theory too well. And I laughed at that because this one was a complete lark, right? I went
yeah,
after it
right.
and it
What
worked
wouldn't
out,
fit the
but
theory? Yeah.
yeah, and it turned out that there is quite a bit of variation within a neighborhood, in this case, operationalized as census tracts, which some people be familiar with, but essentially spaces with about a couple thousand people in them. There was pretty major variation in heat, even more so in air pollution, and even more so in stormwater flooding of which places, which street segments get affected by those things relative to others. And the kicker on that, here's the kicker, and just to add the one last thing, not only is that variation pretty substantial when you just look at it kind of blank slate, just looking at where things are and how heat is distributed, air pollution, so on and so forth. But when you take account of the characteristics of every street in the city, so basically you say to yourself, all right, well, roads, places with more roads are going to be hotter because pavement is hot. Places with fewer trees are going to be hotter as well because trees mitigate heat. Right? When you start to take it into account those things, you actually reveal that over 80% of the variance was the streets. 80% of the differences between neighborhoods is the streets that are in those neighborhoods. And what that tells you is two things are going on, right? One is that indeed we are historically concentrating uncomfortable conditions, right? The drivers of uncomfortable conditions in certain places, and more often than not, those are the places where lower income and people of color live. But second, the processes that are creating the discomfort in those places that are making them uncomfortable to be in are actually happening hyper locally. They're happening at the street level. And that means that not the entire neighborhood is experiencing it. And also means that in order to fix it, we actually have to go from the bottom up. We have to find
Yeah, totally.
localized solutions street to street. Otherwise, you can't undo what's been done.
Well, that's a perfect segue, Dan, to the last two chapters of the book, which does focus on what we do um, um, with all of this. I want to have you describe what you label the problem properties task force. So this is back to crime, but it's applies equally to environmental parameters as well. So could you please describe the problem properties task force and how it works?
Absolutely. And just to note, I don't label it the Problem Properties Task Force. That's actually the name of the ordinance that
Okay.
created this thing. So they're a legal body. And so the Problem Properties Task Force is this really interesting, really interesting structure, if you will, within Boston city government, where 3 mayors ago 3 mayors ago, Mayor Menino, who was at that time the longest standing mayor in the United States, he established this body. And the body was actually an inter agency body. So it was intended to target properties that were inordinately problematic within communities and treated them basically as a burden on the neighborhood around them. And the task force included obviously the police force, but also included inspectional services. It included the fire department, included the housing authority, it included Department of Innovation Technology because they were using data systems to assess things. It included the Public Health Commission, right?
All the institutions that might have be relevant to the problem.
Exactly, exactly. Everyone who might touch this sort of thing. And basically, the way they operate is they receive nominations for properties. Those nominations can come from departments themselves, or those nominations can come from community members. And they have to pass, the property needs to pass a certain threshold of complaint calls that are either regard violence or crime or like dilapidation and health threatening dilapidation over the last year. And if they reach that point, then there's cause for an investigation. And the investigation, they send a letter to the property owner. Um, they send a letter to the property owner, and they basically tell them you're under investigation, and unless you get this all fixed up, we will charge you every time we have to send a police detail, an inspector, or anything else to your property. So it's a rather heavy stick that they wield over the problem property landowner. And then, generally speaking, negotiation ensues, and they never get to the point of levying all those fines, but sometimes they
There's your
do.
point. I mean, for me, this has Eleanor Ostrom written all over it. In this case,
Mm,
graduated sanctions, where first of all, you're able to severe heavy sanctions, but that's not how you begin. You begin with a conversation, basically, and then hopefully, and which doesn't even necessarily condemn the property owner, might not even be that person's fault. You don't know until you examine it. So basically, an examination of the context, as I understand it, and which typically can become fixed at early stages, but if not, then it's capable of escalating. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's right. I think it's a if you were to be polite, you would say that that letter is an invitation to a problem-solving conversation. Uh, it's a rather threatening one, but it's an invitation at
Well, it's
least.
not one that you could ignore.
No, although we actually did an analysis of this and we found that there is a certain proportion of so only about 20% of properties that go into investigation actually then get designated as problem properties, which is when they start charging for, extra activities and such. Only 20%, so very small. And we did an analysis and we found that the vast majority of those are people who do not live in the state of Massachusetts. So whether they were willfully ignoring or just had no idea they were getting this letter, those were the folks that seemed to be non-responsive.
Okay, okay, that's awesome. That's awesome. Now I want to quote from your book on this. So uh, so the PPTF uh, is representative of a new wave of hyperlocal interventions for crime enforcement and blight remediation that have taken root in at least 34 towns, cities, and counties in the United States and Canada. Such programs are science-driven as they convert the concepts of concentrations of crime and place management into effective strategies for enhancing public safety. They're also often community-led, or at least community-informed, as they ask local stakeholders and practitioners to identify the places most in need of attention. We do not, however, know how they work in practice. Because of this, you received National Science Foundation funding in order to find out. And you report some of that progress in your book, but now I'd just love you to report the results of your research, not on just on what's taking place in Boston, but what appears to be quite a movement. Please tell us more about that.
It is, and there are different places doing different things. I've been in touch with a few of them. I think few of them have as elaborated of a process as Boston does, which uh, in a way has been the story of the last 15 years of my career. Boston has been sort of a very lucky place to be able to work as a researcher who wants to have civic impact with his work. Places Boston is doing things at a generally more sophisticated level than a lot of other places, and also more willing than your average city, and more capable. Like they produced all the data for this, right? They basically handed me like a pile of spreadsheets to do these analyses, right? A lot of cities are not, and more so now than 10 years ago, but a lot of cities are not prepared to just do that and have it be actionable. So I think the overall story is that there are other places doing things like this. I don't think they're evaluating them in as much detail or tracking everything in as much detail. Um, but I think that the evidence from Boston would suggest that they're probably having impact, and there's value to these interventions in the other places.
I feel there's something very general going on here that can be described in general terms and that has many different manifestations or implementations. First, let me describe another manifestation and then try to describe what's going on in all cases in general terms. It's the problem of homelessness and Roseanne Haggerty's approach to it and her organization, Community Solutions, which received a MacArthur Foundation $100 million grant several years ago to implement this in over 100 locations around America. And what it involves, they call it functional zero, built for zero. First, you get all the stakeholders in the location, a city or county, that's in a position to do something about homelessness, just as you described for your case. And so now you're coordinating all the stakeholders, and then you bring that to bear on each and every individual homeless person as a specific case. And so contextual that you don't know what part of the system that you need to draw upon in order to solve the problem of any particular individual. And so that's that combination of a whole system approach and then a highly contextual approach is what that does. And I think it's a perfectly good description of what the property task force also does. It gets all the
Mm.
stakeholders together, And instead of bringing it to bear upon a homeless person, it brings it to bear upon a problem property. And so the general formulation of this is that nearly all problems are complex systems problems. They're not going to solve them in isolation. And so, therefore, you have to be working at the scale of the whole complex system. And because everything is so contextual, then you have to bring that to bear on every manifestation of the problem in a very contextual fashion. So that combination of a whole system approach, and that's a high level, and then a lower level contextual approach is, I think, a general description of solving any complex problem, no matter what it might be. So if you could comment on that, and then just as you would.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's exactly right, and that becomes actually sort of a theme of the latter portion of the book and how we need to think about these sorts of interventions. And the Anne Haggerty example is a great one. Obviously, came before the book, but it fits really well with the argument I'm trying to make, which is we can identify general relationships, right? That's the project that is science. We need to discern and identify these sort of general, we can call them causal or semi-causal relationships, but these processes and mechanisms that drive our day-to-day experiences. But when we want to bring those to bear on a particular neighborhood, let's say, we then are handed a map of that neighborhood, and that map has dozens of streets in it, and they all vary, and they vary in a way that is unique to that neighborhood and unique to the experiences of the people who live in that neighborhood. And one of my favorite examples to kind of illustrate this is thinking about heat. Let's just say you had a perfect heat map of a neighborhood, but you knew nothing of the neighborhood otherwise. Then you might identify a given place like, oh, that needs trees over there. And someone who lives in the neighborhood might look at that and say, like, oh, that's a freight yard. We don't go there. Don't waste trees on the freight, right? This place over here that's a little cooler that you didn't notice because it's a few degrees cooler than that other place,
That's the
that's where the
park where we hang out. Yeah.
exactly, that's the park. That's the school, right? That's the place that needs trees because of our lived experience of wanting that to be cooler and not really caring about the freight yard
Well,
that you
this brings up the need for everything to be participatory and the challenges that that brings. So let's talk about how do we make this participatory, including some of the techniques that you use on and your colleagues on participatory modeling, which in the first place is participatory. You're involving everyone, um, and at the same time, it results in something that looks like a a box and arrow map, a proper model of the complex system. So that's an amazing accomplishment to be able to do that, receive input from people who are not experts, that maybe not be highly educated or anything like that, and authentically consult with them, and then end up something which is actually, something that you can study scientifically.
yeah, it's a great point, David. And so, I mean, just practically, well, I'll start with the esoteric or the theoretical. And I was having this conversation with someone talking about this book a few weeks ago, and this woman asked this interesting question, and what she kind of highlighted, and I really like the way she worded it, that the scale of jurisdiction, the scale of intervention, and the scale of data governance somehow have to come together for this participatory angle to work. And that is to say, essentially, that the community needs to, if it's a community level intervention, they need to have some sort of autonomy over the decision making process, but they also have to have some sort of autonomy over the technology and information that's brought to bear and can inform that process. And I mean, you're turning a couple of boats in the harbor at that point at the same time. So it's challenging, but I don't think it's impossible, and I think it is doable, and it's very much. I mean,
I mean, you describe that in your book with the data sensors for pollution and heat, in which you make sure it's not gathering personal data, so on and so forth, and so that it will
yeah.
not be seen as invasive for the residents. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And so actually, that's and that's the practical example I was ready to go to. So yeah, I'm glad we're on the same page.
Yes, we were.
So that one it's in the book. Now the book was published earlier this year, and therefore I stopped writing it like a year and change ago. That sensor project, we just completed installing the final sensor on Halloween this year. So we now have a 75 plus sensor system in a relatively small area in south central Boston, in a neighborhood called Roxbury. And the sensor system, not only is it one of the densest environmental sensor systems we know of in the country, it's the only one of that size and density that we know of that is completely co-designed by the community. And that took a really long time, right? We originally, it's funny, we sat down with our partners 2.5 years ago, actually a little bit more now, almost 3 years ago. And our first thought was like, okay, we're going to go into the community. We're going to ask them where they want to put sensors. And, we'll bring a sensor to the workshop and we'll talk about what a sensor is and then we'll get it. And then, like, someone from one of our community based organizations, one of our partners, kind of looked at us and was like, do you think people even know what an environmental hazard is? That word you're using doesn't mean anything to the people that you want to talk to. And you're like, huh, amazing. You're right. And then it was a back and forth where it wasn't even about education level, it was about vocabulary and about forms of expertise where when we then asked that by saying like, well, it's heat and it's flooding and it's air pollution and it's noise and they're like, oh, well that makes sense. But then we're going to have a whole series of workshops that makes that clear and engages everybody in that. So we spent 6 months going into communities and co-hosting workshops where the only point of the night was to have everybody just create maps where they put sticky notes on the maps saying where hazards were in their community. And they named any hazard went, right? We had special ones for the main ones for the project, which are heat, noise, and flooding.
Some that you might not have considered.
Yeah, and air pollution. But then after that, like a lot of complaints about rats.
I was
You
going to
can't,
mention them, rats.
yeah, a lot of complaints about rats. Now you can't track rats with a sensor, so it ended up not being a focal point of the project, but it actually became a thing that we're still using 311 data to give them back that information as best we can. And so it made for a richer project and but it also made for kind of this much slower on ramp of figuring out shared vocabulary and what these terms that the quote unquote the scientific experts, right, the scientists and the practitioners who have kind of lived adjacent to that world, the words and concepts that we've created for ourselves to make sense of this space, finding kind of common language around those things so that we all knew what we were all talking about, and it gave the community the ability to be a little bit more certain in basically voicing their perspective on it in a way that it was easier to incorporate into a conversation about then, okay, so now if the sensors are going to be yours, if they're going to serve the community, where do they need to be based on this conversation we just had about environmental hazards? And so then the conversation essentially proceeded from there and just a continuous exercise of translation
Well, let me
between
focus on that word
vocabularies.
focus on that word continuous. That this does have to be a continuous feedback process. It can't be something which has a beginning and ending, and then it terminates. So, how do you assure that it's actually a process of continuous interaction and improvement?
Well, that's through partnership, right? And we have this kind of multi-level partnership, which has been fantastic. We've been partnering directly with two community-based organizations in the community. One named the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which is actually you would find them fascinating, David. They're a community land trust, and they're actually the first ever non-government to be given powers of eminent domain in the United States.
Wow, I want to know
Yeah.
more. Give me
Oh yeah,
information.
late
I'll put it in the liner notes.
Yeah, definitely. Late 1980s, early 1990s, they identified the blight in that part of Boston as such an issue, and they got the mayor to grant them eminent domain to just take abandoned parcels and turn them into housing for local residents. And so they're a fascinating organization with such a deep and special history.
Sounds to be
And
quite a long-standing organization, not young. So basically
oh
having
yeah.
to, okay,
Yeah, they've been around for nearly 40 years total since their first board election. And they've got, yeah, they've navigated all sorts of things. They have a very intricate organizational structure. Yeah, so they're fantastic to work with, and also fantastic to work with our other partner, Project Right, in Grove Hall, and they were founded in the early 90s as basically as an anti-gang violence consortium of local stakeholders, and they've evolved to do more and more things in the community. And it's fascinating because the two organizations are structured differently. They have different histories, right? One literally is a home ownership association at some level, right? And the other one is a little more of a traditional, consortium of nonprofits and businesses in a CBO. But so we've been working with the two of them, and we talk to them all the time. We meet monthly. We actually are meeting tomorrow for our monthly meeting to kind of catch up on project stuff, what happens next. All workshops are co-hosted between us and either both of them or one of them, oftentimes in DSNI's space, which is beautiful, but in other spaces around the community. Uh, there's a lot of entrees into, other local institutions and organizations that DSNI and Project Right take the lead on. And we bring as much as we can you know, the resources and particular expertise of the university to bear on the project. And we do keep thinking about, okay,
universities. I mean, BARI is a consortium of universities, plural, right? Because you have so many universities in the Boston area. Is that right?
that is true. Although on this project is all the principal investigators, right? All the science personnel on this project are Northeastern.
Okay,
So it's yeah. So the BARI consortium is separate at times from specific projects that are coming
sure.
out of BARI. Uh, but yeah, so we bring it to bear, and there are times when we bring in collaborators because there's a lot of people doing environmental justice research in Greater Boston, and so we bring in folks from BU, Boston University, on occasion, Emerson College, MIT, Harvard, to be part of the conversation when relevant. But it's been a lot of just trust building and relationship building with those organizations, and we're now at the point where, you know I'm down at DSNI probably 3, 4 times a month, depending on what's going on. And we all know each other at this point. We're people to each other. We're not just representatives of institutions. And I think, as trite or trivial as that might sound, that's a crucial aspect to these sorts of collaborations, and making them sustained over time. And then just keeping always the eye on the prize. This is about more than just installing sensors. Now that the sensors are installed, now we get to do really fun work. We get to put data in the hands of the community. And this is actually what we're going to be talking about tomorrow. We have to start planning workshops and activities that are going to involve youth. We have a local high school chemistry teacher that we've been working with as well, and we want to put those data in the hands of as many people from the community as we can, and
Sure.
then facilitate
Science projects with
conversations.
high schools. Yeah.
Exactly. And facilitate conversations like, well, what do we do with this? What do you want the neighborhood to look like? How could we take action and advocate on this?
Yeah. So let's segue to three things just to keep it economical. One is Boston as a city, and then we have its mayor, who seems to be amazing. And then we have Bari, which might just be part of the reason why Boston is amazing, and the mayor
I'm not
has
taking that credit, but I appreciate you putting it out there.
up and so and what other cities can learn. But begin with Boston. So what is it that's making Boston really a city on the hill, you might say, to look up to? A bit about its mayor, well, her contribution as a person, although these things are systemic, and so it's not as if some magic wizard comes in and just makes things work. And then of course, um, something like BARI, which is bringing in this whole everything we've been talking about. Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think the Boston situation is unique for a couple reasons. One of them is just the unparalleled density of higher education. as a result, I mean, we have over 35 colleges and institutions with some sort of presence in Greater Boston. And so just having that creates a fascinating situation in terms of the demographic composition, right? The place is incredibly highly educated. But then what ends up happening is then that that education permeates everywhere. So every organization, every institution, every public agency is not rubbing shoulders with everybody else who has either come out of this system or is adjacent to this system in some way. So everyone has this, and the private corporations are like that too. So there's this constant understanding of the value of innovation, evaluation, data, research, right? There's a real
Okay.
commitment to all those things, and it's just sort of in the water, right? It's just here. And I think that's why BARI was even possible. Because there was this many organizations on the academic side, but also that there's so much overlap and passage between the two, between academia and every other type of organization in the city, that it makes it possible to always be thinking in terms of some of these tools, the tools that I think university brings to the table that are of real value. Uh, and then beyond that, right, there's this interesting story with Mayor Menino, who I mentioned earlier, where Mayor Menino was mayor of the city for about 20 years. I think it was 22. You might need to fact check me on that one, but he was mayor for a very long time. And he also had an approval rating of somewhere around 80% by the time he was done. And what that means for a guy who's been in office for that long is that somewhere around 2008 or so, he realized he could do whatever he wanted. And that could often lead to corruption. In this case, it led to him just getting really creative and allowing young people who he was hiring directly out of fellowships being run by schools like especially the Harvard Kennedy School, but some others locally as well. He was hiring people from those fellowships straight in and saying, "Pitch me, show me something awesome."
Okay.
And so some of my closest colleagues to this day are these two guys, Chris Osgood and Nigel Jacob, who were originally they started as fellows, and at first they had like a little project there, a
Now,
little
what is a
project.
fellow? A fellow is someone that's working for the city. It's something like an intern or something like that. Just some.
Basically, it's a high level intern. It's like you have a master's or pursuing a master's or even a PhD, and you have an entire summer or you have a semester worth appointment to try to do a project. They're
Okay.
generally project based.
Okay.
And so they had like an initial project or two, but they really distinguished themselves. And then within a year or two, they suddenly were put in charge of this new mayor's office of new urban mechanics, and they were the innovation shop, right? They were R&D for the city. And they were the people who originally championed 311, the 311 system for the city as a new way.
311 for our audience is the three-digit telephone number that you call to report any minor dysfunction, not an emergency like 911, any minor dysfunction. There's a whole wonderful story. Your previous book, The Urban Commons, um, tells that story. I wish we had time to tell it here, but anyhow, keep on going.
Yeah, but precisely. That was very succinct. Nicely done, David. That's better than I was going to do. And so, then they, but not just they, a lot of others were put in these positions to innovate. And it really created a sort of culture of innovation and experimentation in a government that had previously looked a lot like we think of a lot of urban governments from the 20th century, where things operated on whether you had an uncle in public works or not, right? And a lot of we don't like to say the word patronage, but a lot of patronage, and very shall we say entrenched Irish American and Italian American influence, given the demographics of Boston specifically, right? It basically evolved from that in a matter of a few years because of the space and latitude Menino gave his young hires
Well,
at that time.
you've told me in the past that this has all become so useful that no new mayor would ever think of getting rid of it. I mean, it's just too embedded in a good sense, and too darn useful that no one would. So it's achieved a kind of institutional longevity that that transcends administrations. Is that right?
I think that's mostly true. And I think as a culture of innovation and best practices, absolutely. I think the place where a progressive mayor can run into challenges with it is that it worked really well for Menino because Menino was a neighborhood guy. He was the kind of guy who believed, and probably rightfully so, if you keep the potholes filled, you keep the people happy. That's what the people want, right? They just want to live a good basic life. And progressive mayors have gone past that in trying to solve real major social challenges of urban life. You know, racial inequities, things of
Okay,
that
I can see
nature.
the tension. I can see the tension that you're drawing attention to.
Yeah, or like how do you fix urban public education, which deals with all sorts of historical and kind of uh, wicked problems, if you will, right? Highly tangled problems that are going to be challenging to overcome in one fell swoop. And it's not the same as like it it doesn't lend itself quite the same way as we want to fill potholes? Why don't we enlist the community as collaborators, create the 311 system, and then people pick up the phone and call, we come and fill the pothole, and look, it's this brilliant technological solution to a problem that we all shared. It's more challenging than that when you start getting into really deep social issues. And so I think that
Sure.
that's something, and I'm definitely not saying the Wu administration or other progressive administrations are eschewing data driven thinking or research driven thinking in any way, but I think it's not as tidily served up for them the way it might have been for a let's fix the potholes kind of mayor.
Well, I can't resist telling one 311 story before moving on to Michelle Wu, your current mayor. That story from your book is that after 311 was implemented in Boston and other cities, the state of Massachusetts decided it was such a good idea that they tried to make it possible for all the towns and cities in Massachusetts to implement 311. And you were on hand to study which ones actually made use of the opportunity and which ones didn't. And what you discovered was that it was just so contingent. I mean, to do something like this involves, multiple moving parts coming together. Sometimes they did, more often they didn't, and it was very hard to predict the details. So even when something that's just plain good sense, everybody should want it, and so on, is um, is made available, that'll fix potholes, as you put it. Still, it can be difficult. And why is that? Is because it's a complex systems that's evolving. It's not just like a single trait. It's just you're changing something systemic, and that is inherently not easy. It's inherently even when the goal is something everybody wants. And so, if you want to speak to us on that theme, it just makes problems doubly wicked because even when it's just a win-win, even then it's not straightforward.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right, right? And to put it as a quip, right? There's only one way that a complete administrative change works, and there's 1,000 ways it can fall,
Right. Just like
right?
every
'Cause
happy family is alike and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
exactly, right? You need all the parts to fall into place. And so, you might find out that the mayor didn't champion it, or you might find out that the director of public works was not interested, even though the mayor wanted to, or you might find out that, they didn't really advertise. And so the community didn't even know it was there. And so no one was calling, right? So there's all sorts of different ways that this can go wrong. And there is a city not in my Massachusetts study. There is a city that I know of that has a new mayor Wilson that does not have a 311 system, and the lore that I have heard on that is that in the 2015 2018 range, give or take, there was, and it was not the mayor, but there was one high ranking official in the city who felt this was a bad idea for various reasons. I think actually just a particular reason in my understanding, but felt it was a bad idea. It got blocked. And to this day, there is no 311 system in Seattle.
All right. All right. We'll get back to Seattle at the very end, but tell us about Mayor Wu and what she adds as an individual or her style of governor that makes her so popular.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Why is Mayor Wu so popular? I think she does a very, very good job, and I think she reflects the ethos of the city. And in urban politics, you're only as good as the coalition you're able to build. And she's built a pretty powerful coalition of, not to diminish things demographics, but white liberals and people of color. And that at this point in time is well past the majority of Boston, uh, demographically speaking. And it's been a really strong coalition. I think it's been a natural coalition philosophically of late, given the focus that both have placed on equity and justice as something that has been lacking historically, and something that there's a need for um, reparation, and not necessarily in the formal reparations sense, but in the sense of kind of moving forward and making things better. And I think that's been a really powerful cocktail that she's managed to be able to speak thoroughly to, while also being a policy wonk, right? Um, when she was first elected, there were even some concerns that like her administration could be, political science dissertation as mayorship, as mayoralty,
That
because
describes my daughter to a T. So keep going.
I mean, like I had a meeting with one of her policy advisors when she was first elected who said, "What do you know about reconstructing entire agencies?" Because one of the things she had ran on was dismantling a historic body called the at that time it was called the Boston Planning and Development Authority. It had previously been the Boston Redevelopment Authority. It was part of the slum clearing history, the rather damaging slum clearing history of the 1950s and 60s in Boston. And she thought that it was structured in such a way that made it unaccountable to the people, and she wanted to just basically dismantle it and redesign it. And I remember them asking that question. I was like, I might be able to find you a policy expert who can tell you about that, but that's like in practice, just experimentation and politics, right? You just gotta figure out how you're gonna organize it. So it was a fascinating thing to realize that that was what her administration, that was first on their list, and she did it, and it seems to be rather successful.
Well, I want to take
Uh,
note. I mean, that's the kind of leveling that the Trump administration does in a wrecking ball kind of way. And the idea that you might see some part of the city, some institution, which is like deeply problematic, and you want to rethink the whole thing, and that actually you could do that kind of thing. But how you do it is completely different, of course, than the wrecking ball approach. But nice to know that that kind of whole system change is possible if you're smart enough about how to go about it.
yeah, and she did, and she did a couple of things. I don't need to bore your listeners with all of the sort of institutional machinations that she then proceeded to kind of use to shift personnel around, shift budgetary structures around to make it all work. But so yeah, so she did a good bit of that up front, but since then she's really been sort of speaking as much as she can, and acting as much as she can toward the needs and interests of the everyday Bostonian, right? Recognizing real challenges. I mean, she's had some things that, she just got reelected, and in the reelection campaign, there were some things that she definitely was given a little bit of a hard time on. The people are still not clear what's going on with a particular part of the city called Mass and Cass, where there's just it's also known as methadone mile. It's where all of the services for drug abuse are, and therefore it becomes basically just an encampment of people who are not having the best day, week, or month of their lives. And so that's been challenging for her. And there's been some dust ups about bike lanes and who owns the roads. So there's some places there, but I think overall she has been good at hearing what people want and need. And I think she has been trying as much as she can to make the administration responsive, and proactive in trying to get community voice involved in decision making.
Okay, so now a little bit about BARI. You've already mentioned the kind of the high degree of education and research in the city, the density of universities and so on and so forth. And then, but in particular, BARI, and you're a modest person, so you're not going to claim too much for it, but what is the role of a consortium such as BARI in this, in the coordination? I mean, I think just from our conversation, our listeners will appreciate there's a very large role indeed. That if you didn't have something like this, then I mean, there's so much that would not take place. But let's focus on BARI just a bit, and then we'll finish up with just a little word about Seattle.
Yeah. Oh, what is BARI giving? It's a good question. And as you note, I sometimes prefer to do the work and not reflect too much on that, but it's useful to reflect on it at times. I think that what's important about what we do is we give space and create the space to develop a community of practice around civic research. And that essentially, right, the goal, and to kind of give your listeners a little bit more context, right? So the thing that we do that's most important is we host an annual conference called Greater Boston's Annual Insight to Impact Summit. And it's attended by somewhere in the ballpark of 425 people every year. And that includes probably equal parts academics, public officials, and nonprofit practitioners. We had we have over 100 different organizations and agencies represented every year, and we we organize it very much as kind of a grassroots sort of community. It's almost like we took the society meeting model from academia and we adapted it to the concept of a community where everyone is not studying the same thing, but everyone is using civic research to benefit this region. And so then we come together and have that conversation. And so there's a panel on transportation. There's a panel on there's actually normally two panels on environmental justice. There's a panel on education. There's a panel on this, that, the other thing, and there's a keynote, and there's a whole day, an opportunity for us not only to explore specific results and how they might be used, or specific policy innovations or interventions or evaluations, and how they might be unfolding, but also to develop, as I said, a community of practice around, well, what does it mean for us all to be doing this together and alongside each other? What are our norms? What are our expectations? How should this be integrated into policy? How should it be a part of the way community-based organizations do their work? How do we all bring our respective expertises and use them together so that everything is richer than just the sum of its parts? And that I think is a special thing, right? For a city to have and to own for itself. And to be honest, I don't know of any other city. There's a couple of others that are trying to do things like this. Some where it's easier, like South Bend, where Mayor Pete Buttigieg established a really strong relationship with Notre Dame. And so then you have this kind of you have one major university and you have a not exceptionally large city working together, and it's pretty cohesive. Or Toronto has been trying to do some stuff like this. But apart from those sporadic examples, I think we're one of the only ones that have really kind of surfaced that community and given it identity, and granted it identity. And when we started hosting that conference in 2017, I I'd like to claim that that was my hope, right? I think I did at that time use the phrase, we're going to raise a mirror up to everybody, right? We're going to raise a mirror up to this community that we know exists but doesn't really know itself as a community yet. And I think we got there. And I think we've arrived in the last, especially post pandemic. I think it really has a momentum of its own where I sat back, I think it was at the 2022 conference, which was our first one really in person after the pandemic. And I remember sitting back and turning to my colleague, a woman named Kim Lucas, who's associate director for BARI and a close colleague for years now. And I remember looking at her and telling her, "We don't own this anymore.
That's
Like
the
this isn't."
nicest thing you could say. That's the most wonderful thing that someone who tries to create something can say is that this does not depend on me anymore. I
Exactly.
could go
As you
away.
well
I could
know.
go away and it would not, and it would remain, I think is
Yeah, exactly. Exactly that sentiment. And I think that that's the thing we've offered. And then that spirit, whether it's referred to as Bari all the time, whatever Bari contributed to, that spirit and that energy and that shared knowledge, practice, expertise, I feel like is permeating all over the place. And we're responsible for some minor proportion of it. But the fact that we're there and giving it some voice, I think, is a really important component.
well, I have now the perfect way to end because, of course, Katie was been compared to Mamdani again and again. So we have like,
I noticed that.
progressive East and progressive West. And so we have two cities, New York and Seattle. You did not mention New York among the cities that are doing something Bari-like. And if you could comment briefly on why isn't, or maybe it is, but comment a bit on New York City. Why isn't that a big mecca for this? Or maybe it is. And then Seattle, what do you know about Seattle? I mean, in terms of how it stands out, because nobody can be in a better position than you in just knowing what's going on in cities in America and around the world.
Well, New York. New York's a complicated case. I mean, in some ways, it was at the forefront of this at a certain point under the Bloomberg administration,
Yeah,
because
okay.
Bloomberg, I mean, if nothing else, a data guy. And and he led the way. One of my favorite things that he did, I don't know, favorite in the sense that I would have done it, but favorite in terms of like, oh, that worked, was so New York is the only city that I know that has this structure, but they're so big that every agency has its own IT department. And so he basically said, you will create open data or I will cut your IT budget. And lo and behold, the open data portal was populated. Uh, Sometimes with non-machine readable messes that no one could actually do anything with, as people were abiding by the letter of the law, not the spirit of the law. But still, it was rather effective, if a little draconian. And so it was leading at that point. But what's very interesting about New York is the university structure is different, and so you've got NYU and you've got Columbia and you've got a whole lot of others that I could list
Well,
off.
you
You
have
got
the whole Cooney system.
the whole Cooney system. You've got Fordham. You've got Merrimack. You've got Manhattan. You've got Manhattanville. All these places that are either in New York or just outside. And for some reason, no one stood up to try to coalesce them as a set of partners. There is a program there called Town and Gown that tries a lot to facilitate procurement, so that the city can more easily procure the work of researchers and scholars. But I don't know if it gets lost in the mix because it's such a large city, but you don't hear a lot coming out of it as like a self-identifying community of people who are doing this stuff. And Seattle, I would not say similar or dissimilar, but Seattle is has not had that history. There was a period where University of Washington was doing a decent amount with the city and creating relationships there. But beyond that, I'm not aware of a whole lot. But I do think the creation of a Bari type entity, it requires some institution standing up and being willing to put that capital out front. And you know, my colleague Kim Lucas, who I just mentioned, she spent a short period of time as executive director of the Metro Lab Network, which is a well, it has now ended, but was a consortium of about 40 of these city university partnerships around the country. And what Kim would always note was that the only other one that had sort of the scope of Bari was in Kansas City, but it was dictated by the philanthropies. The philanthropies basically said, "We're giving you all money. You're going to work together now. Sit down, talk to each other." And it was like, if you're getting money, you're at this table. If you're not at this table, you're not getting money. And a very interesting way to leverage, power, to force people to do something good for themselves. I don't know if that model is sustainable without the money, right?
Yeah, right.
Um, Whereas there's no other one that Kim could name or that I could name that is university led. It's the universities taking responsibility for themselves
Where do you get your money?
to.
But where does how is BARI supported? Is it philanthropy or grants or the university commits or?
It's a mixture of things, and I tend to and there's a distinction in some ways between our projects as BARI. You could think of it as like BARI research projects, which are not everybody, and then kind of the organizational activities and programming that we do, that try to foster the whole community. The things on the latter end, the ones that try to foster the whole civic research community, we fundraise that through local philanthropy, and we fundraise that through sponsorships to the conference, and that's actually where we get a lot of our academic partners to bring a small amount of resources to the table that makes it possible for us to have the full-time staff to be able to then host a 425 person free conference every year that has a grassroots built agenda, right? Those sorts of
Do
things
you
are
have
not
corporate? Do
possible
you
if you
have
don't have
corporate
staff.
sponsorship? Are corporations involved?
Microsoft has been very generous over the years. They have a very active city and community engagement team here in Boston, based technically in Cambridge. But that's about it. Corporations, by and large, have found us not exceptionally interesting, because I mean, you could probably rationalize it a number of different ways, but the read that I get is that we don't provide enough exposure, right? And half of a sponsorship is exposure, and our exposure is rather local, and so it's I think a little less appealing, and it doesn't capture that extra advantage of philanthropy for a corporation.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, I think that's basically, I'm so happy to have recorded this down and I think I've covered everything I want to cover. Is there anything remaining that you want to cover?
I want to make a pitch.
Good. Go
And
for it.
it's one that I feel like I shouldn't be bringing this up now. It's what my wife, who's a therapist, calls a doorknob comment. I don't know if you're familiar with this
I
phrase,
don't know that
but
comment.
okay. So for you and for your audience, a doorknob comment is like you get to minute 55 of your therapy session, and you're walking out the door, and you turn around and say something like, "Oh, by the way, did I mention I had a blowout fight with my mother on the phone yesterday?"
All right. I know I have experience with the doorknob comments like that. Yeah, with a certain daughter who's just become mayor, but keep going.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Well, so we all do them, and so this is one I'm going to throw out there to you because I think you'll find it fascinating, and I'm throwing it out there to your daughter as well, to Mayor Wilson. Um, One of the things that you probably noticed in the book, that I harp on near the end is another Eleanor Ostrom thing, to make reference to something you said probably 45 minutes to an hour ago. Uh, is another Eleanor Ostrom thing, which is this concept, this joint concept of local autonomy and nested governance. And and the thing from the book that I find the most sort of speculative but exciting in its speculation is the idea that cities could potentially reorganize their governing systems to embody that. Because I don't think they entirely do at the moment. There are neighborhood associations in probably most to all cities. Do they have a formal government role? Not often. Like they might get tasked. So the Problem Properties Task Force in Boston might ask neighborhood associations or implicitly invite them to nominate problem properties, but it's not a formalized relationship where there is something that the neighborhood association is explicitly both tasked and privileged to have jurisdiction over and decision making power over, that funnels up into the higher body, right, being the city in this case, and that the city agency then is tasked with communicating with, empowering, and coordinating all of those local bodies. And those local bodies cover the entirety of the city. And I think if we're going to be honest about the fact that every neighborhood is its own unique landscape that needs its own unique interventions that need to be sort of tailor-made by and with and for community, then we really need to take local autonomy and nested governance seriously. And I don't think we know what it is. I don't think we know how it
Hmm.
works entirely and what we need to design there. And I want to challenge any new mayor, especially a progressive mayor like Katie, to really think about, are there opportunities to experiment with that, and start
Wow.
to see what it becomes.
Oh, I could not have dreamt or imagined a better ending, Dan. What a doorknob comment that was. That was just awesome. Polycentric governance is what it's all about. And to
Yeah.
really embrace that concept to the fullest, I think is exactly what needs to be done. So, what a perfect ending. So, I'm not going to say anything more, just to leave our audience with that thought, and then we can continue from there. So, Dan, thank you so much. I'm so proud not only of my daughter Katie, but you. I mean, so it's just amazing what you have done. So, all right, we move forward.
I appreciate that, David. And it's been a
All right,
pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this.
all righty.